ignore that. Strike that from your mind. It never happened. It's baggage from last week. Because we're in a new series this week. And we're in a new series this week on the Trinity, and we're going to be doing this for a few weeks now. And first of all, let me thank everybody who had a hand in the service today, because what they went through to bring this off is kind of stunning. So Josh is out of town. He's on a well-deserved vacation, and then his backup was taken ill, and so this is like, we have people who are doing jobs that they normally don't do and have no real discernible experience in doing, and so they are working really hard to try to pull things together. So thank you guys very much for everything that you're doing for us today. There is so much that goes on in making one of these services happen, and it is not an easy thing to do. So I actually have the easy part. I just have to stand in front of you guys and speak a little bit. They have a lot harder job. So we're going to be talking about this new sermon series, and as we do it, it's kind of frightening, because as I was relating to our Sunday school class and telling them that this is what we're going to be doing, when you talk about the Trinity is a very difficult subject, and it's one that the church has been refining for 2,000 years, and it's very technical. And at any moment, if you veer off course just a little bit, you're into heresy. And I try to keep my heresy preaching to a minimum. I try very hard to engage in as little of that as possible, and yet in doing the sermon series, it's at every turn. It's the possibility of drifting into it is very close. And so I would appreciate your prayers in helping me not to be a heretic. So I appreciate that a lot. But also, there's a lot of goodness to be mined from this. There's so much here that we have to take on the risk and go forward in this, because there's just too much goodness to be had here. Now, in talking about the Trinity, we're talking about something that's very confusing, and it's even confusing to people who have been Christians for a long time. And we're hoping to bring some clarity to this, as well as just helping you to understand the God that you have a relationship with. We've been talking in the last few sermon series, we've been talking about the covenant with God and your relationship with God. It really makes sense to spend some time talking about the God that you have a relationship with. And so we're going to be talking about this through the next few weeks. And today we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12 and 13. And we're going to be talking about knowing and being known. Because this is really the first step in encountering the Trinity, is understanding that there is a relationship possible here. That you're not dealing with a God who's so far distant, that's so far removed from your experience that you can't possibly know who He is. That's a lot of people's view of God, is they use this word God, and in their mind, there's not a lot of content to that word, other than the fact that this is a being who has a lot of power, but other than that is really unknowable. And we want to take that away, because that's not the way that God intended it. God intended you to know Him and to be known by Him. That's what God intended from the beginning. So we need to see that today. In 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 12, now this chapter is incredibly well known. If you've ever been to a wedding, you've heard this chapter. And it's the love chapter. But there's something very interesting in the love chapter that happens toward the bottom of it. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, starting in verse 12, it says, "For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, but the greatest of these is love." In ending the faith chapter, Paul talks about the fact that we're reaching out, and even his description of love in the faith chapter is reaching out to something that is still kind of veiled from us. But at some point, that veil will be lifted. If you remember what happened with Moses when he went up into the mountain, Moses encountered God in order to get the 10 Commandments. And when he came down, his face shone so brightly that he had to put a veil over his face. And God is kind of like that. God shines so brightly that there's a veil over his face to us right now. But eventually that veil will be gone and we will see him face to face. But even through the veil, there's enough light that it bears, there's worth, there's value in us taking a look at this. So what we're going to be looking at today is we're going to answer a few questions. The first one is, what is the nature of God? The second one, and that's easy enough for me, what is the nature of God? How do I get to know God? And finally, what is the relationship of knowing and being known? So these are big questions, and we won't have time to deal with them completely, but we want to take some cracks at these. So the first one, what is the nature of God? And this seems this is a very large question. It seems like you can never get a handle on this. God is infinite. God is all-powerful. God is all-knowing. God is present everywhere. So how do you even begin? And luckily for us, the Bible gives us a big clue. It gives us a handle that we can start understanding the nature of the God who we worship. And it's a really interesting handle because at the same time we have this God who is so far away from us, the Bible gives us a handle to start dealing with him and something that's very near to us. And that is just who the Bible refers to God as. We have a Trinity, we worship a Trinity that is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so the very first handle that the Bible gives us on getting to know this God is it uses the word Father. Now, the problem that we have with this is that obviously we're going to relate this to our own father. Now, if you had a great father, this might be helpful to you. If you had a terrible father, this will be more of a challenge to you. But if we pushed aside your experiences and just looked at the nature of the word itself, we find something really interesting. The first thing that we find is that the nature of this God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that there's a Trinity here. This is one God in three persons. Now that's difficult for us to wrap our head around. One God in three persons. God is Father, Son, and Spirit. And it's not three gods. And it's not one God who kind of manifests himself in three different modes or stages. In fact, there's a heresy called modalism that believes that it's one God and he kind of has different modes. You know, like your car might have different driving modes. That's the same car, but there's different driving modes. That's not exactly what we mean. That's not a proper, accurate description of God. The proper, accurate description of God is one God in three persons. Now, this seems very strange. In fact, a lot of the world will say, I don't understand this. And you might say, I don't understand this. Fair enough. I don't know that anybody completely understands this, but there's some things that we can say about this. First of all, it's not trivial. It's not trivial that this is the way that God is described. And the reason that it's not trivial is this, and hopefully this will make sense to you. When we describe God, we want to know who God is, not just what God does. What I mean by that is this. How many of you ever had a job where you had to wear a uniform? Okay, anyone? You had a job where you had to wear a uniform. Is that who you are? Do you still have that uniform? You still wear it? I probably couldn't fit into mine anymore. I had Kmart's red vest that was always wrinkled. Right? I don't wear that anymore. Why? Because that's not who I am. That's something that I did a while ago, but that's not who I am. You guys know what I'm saying? There's a distinction to be made here between the things that you do and who you are. Now, the things that you do can be a clue to who you are, but there's also a distinction here. You might find yourself doing something that's uncharacteristic. You might find yourself doing something that's out of sorts for you, right? But that's different than who you are. Like, we can explain away. Maybe you were intoxicated, or you had a head injury, or, you can explain things like that. I was sleepwalking. I was whatever. You explain those away, and you say, that's not right. Do you remember back here in the valley a long time ago, there was a guy who stabbed his wife a bunch of times and then drowned her, and he said he was sleepwalking? Do you guys remember that? What was his reason for giving that? It's basically what he's trying to say is, this is not who I am. Yes, this is something that I did, but you shouldn't throw me in prison because it's not who I am. So the reason that the Trinity is important is because we want to understand the nature of God. Not just what he does, but who he is. And what we see in the Trinity is that the fact that God is three persons means that for eternity, he has lived in community. For eternity, he has been, their love has been at the center of who he is. And for eternity, he has been a Father, a Son, and a Spirit. Now, this is really important for us because if God were a singular God, a singularity, then that means that God would not be love until he had a creation to love. And that would mean either love is just something that God does and not who he is, or it means that who he is dependent upon his creation, and that God is no longer an independent being. Now, this might not make a lot of sense to you. This is the things that theologians argue about, but this actually ends up being really, really important. Because God is three in one, that means that he can exist in a community of love, and that the nature of the Father can be fatherhood for eternity. Fatherhood is not something that God does. It's something that God is. God is Father. He's not dependent on his creation. He doesn't need us to be Father. And that means that we are a reflection of him and not him of us. God doesn't look at our fatherhood and say, oh, that's a good idea, I can do that too. Our fatherhood is a reflection of who he is from the beginning. Now the Son, it's important to understand, even though the Son is the Son and the Father is the Father, the Son is eternally existent. There was never a time when the Son did not exist. And you might say, well, that's weird, because that's not how it works in earthly fatherhood. Well, that's true, because we need some time to get our act together, right? So we need some time to get our act together, but God didn't need that. So the Father and the Son, they're eternally coexisting. There's never a time when the Son wasn't the Son and wasn't there. There's never a time the Father wasn't the Father. And one of the ways you can think of this, we were talking about this in our Sunday school class today, is you can think about it from the standpoint of a light. Something like the sun. Now you can say, well, the light is off before it's on, but that's not what I mean by light. For a light to be a light, it needs to be the source of light. And you have two things that happen. You have a light, and then you have the light that radiates from it. And Jesus has eternally been the radiance of the Father. Jesus has eternally been the radiance of the Father. The radiance comes from the Father, but it's always there. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, it says, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sins, he sat down at the right hand of majesty on high. Now, why is this important for us? Because this actually teaches us something primary about God, and that is that God is life. God is life. Now, that might not be important, just hearing it, but it's actually vital to us that God is life. What does that mean? It means that God is. Remember when God was wanting to explain who he was, and he gave a name for himself, and what did he say? He said, I am. That's one of the best names or descriptions of God you could possibly have. I am. God exists. Think about how odd it is that there is something rather than nothing. God is, he exists, he has existed for all eternity. And God's existence is such, God's life is such that not only does he exist, but he brings everything else into existence. God exists and he brings everything else into existence. Now, he didn't just start being that the day that he made creation. because that would make him dependent on who he is on the creation. God is that eternally. He is, he exists, and he brings forth the Son. The Son is the eternal radiance of the Father. He did not begin, and he will not end. Not only is God life, but he is life to the full. God is, he is existence, and it's existence to the full. There's nothing greater, there's nothing better, there's nothing bigger, there's nothing more glorious than who God is. And what that means is this, that evil is not. Now, what do I mean by evil is not? I don't mean that evil doesn't exist. I mean that evil is a negation of something good. God is truth. Evil is a lie. Evil is the absence of truth. God is faithfulness. That means evil is the lack of faithfulness. You see, we often get afraid that evil will triumph, but evil cannot triumph as long as God is. And this means that our future and the future of everything that we hold dear is secure. You see, when you understand the nature of God, that God is, and he always has been, and he always will be, there's no way ever that evil can triumph. You never have to fear that evil will triumph. It never has to be a worry or a concern that evil will triumph, because God is, and he can never not be. And the only time evil can exist is outside of the presence of God. This is why evil cannot exist in the presence of God. Have you ever stopped to think about why it is that God had an angel guarding his presence in the garden when Adam and Eve sinned and they had to go away from him? Because what they brought on themselves is a lack. When God said, when you sin against me, you will surely die, he meant it. When you sin against me, you will bring in non-existence to yourself. And therefore you cannot exist anymore in my presence, because non-existence can't exist in the presence of existence. And so there is a way barred to God. You never have to worry about evil triumphing. God is the existence of everything good. C.S. Lewis wrote about this in The Great Divorce, where he made his characters who were in hell, and all of hell, it seemed like it went on forever, fit in the tiniest crack in the ground in heaven. And the people came up out of hell to experience heaven. And if you remember, they couldn't walk on the grass. It pierced them like little spears. Why? Because the grass of heaven wouldn't bend under their weight, because they had too little existence to do it. He was trying to give poetically and artistically an image for us to understand this idea of God and who he is. God as existence is the giver of life, who brings and continually radiates existence to other things. And this is also important. This isn't something that God just decided to do one day on a lark. The Father has eternally radiated the Son. This life that God has is not something he holds within himself, but he's a giver of life. He gives life and existence to all things. When God creates and he says it is good, why? Because it's a reflection of who he is. He's the author of every good and perfect gift. And in the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, all of the things that he gives us, what you have is you have life to the full. That's what God wants you to have. He wants you to have this ghost life, half existence that you live in sin. He wants that vanished forever, and he wants to give you life to the full. That's who he is. Why? Because God is love. God's desire is constantly self-giving life. That's not something that he just spontaneously does because he's bored. It's who he is. It's his very nature. Why is this important? In the ancient world, they believed in gods and that gods could make things come to life. And they asked themselves, well, why would God do this? And their answer was this: God wants slaves. God wants slaves. God wants slaves to serve him so he doesn't have to work so hard. Now you know why in Acts chapter 17, when Paul goes to the Areopagus, when he's in Athens, he gives this speech, and he says in verse 24, "The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands, as though he had need of anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." You wonder why Paul's saying this, because you know this as a Christian, but you don't know how profound this is. Their view of the gods was these gods, they weren't life, they weren't love. They created things when they felt like it for their own purposes and ends, and those ends were to enslave mankind. It makes a difference to the kind of God that you serve. Do you serve a God who is love, who brings and radiates life itself to things because he loves to do that, because he loves them? Or is he a God who creates you to enslave you? Now the problem is, as Christians, often we live as if we're serving the former kinds of gods, not the kinds of gods that were revealed when Paul gave his speech. Not the kind of God Paul reveals when he speaks in Athens and he says, this is the kind of God who exists. We often act like we serve a God who's trying to enslave us, not a God who's giving us life out of an abundance of love. Speaking of, life just comes on you. The Father begets the radiance of the Son continuously and forever and shares everything with the Son. Now you know why Jesus was constantly saying all that stuff. That he can do nothing but what he sees his Father doing. And the Father loves the Son, and the Son loves the Father. And Jesus, what he's trying to do is he's trying to invite us into this relationship. To say, stop seeing the world the way that you're seeing it. Stop seeing God the way that you're seeing him. That's not who God is. God's saying, I am full of love and life. Everything that I have is pure goodness and life to the full, and I want to share it with you. Why does God call us away from lies and toward truth? Because he loves us. Why does God call us toward faithfulness and away from unfaithfulness? Because he loves us and he wants us to have life to the full. He wants to share himself. There's nothing greater. There's nothing better that he could give to us. The Son is the exact representation as an eternal loving relationship with the Father. So how do I get to know God? So this is the God who I worship. If this is the nature of the God who exists, the second thing that we need to find out is how do I get to know him? In Psalm 19:1, it says something great. It says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. So it's basically saying that everything that you see around you is a message to you about the nature of the God that you serve. Everything that you see around you, you don't ever encounter anything that's not a message to you from God about who he is. I mean, think about it this way. Say you have little kids, okay? And you decide that you want to build a playhouse for them. And so you think about your kids, and you think about the things they love, and you think about the kind of TV shows that they watch, the kinds of characters that they like, and the kinds of things that they love to do, and you think about all that kind of stuff, and you build them a house, and you build it, every inch of that house is done with thought about your children, and about the things that they love. But it also contains a lot of you, doesn't it? You know, even if something happened to you, every time that they walked into that playhouse and they played there, what they would see around them is a message to you, or to them from you. Creation reveals the nature of God. In fact, Romans says it does it so clearly that men are without excuse. Everything in creation exists as a context as environment and analogy. Environment and analogy. What do we mean by that? Well, think about it this way. Let's say you have two people, and you want them to get to know each other really well. And you're also a mad scientist who has no kinds of qualms about doing all kinds of things. And so you say, I want them to know each other really well. I will do this. I will take their brains out of each of their heads, and then I will put them in jars and put the jars next to each other. How else would you, what better way can there be to get to know the mind of another person? You guys are looking at me like, but I haven't done this, okay? I'm not a mad scientist. Don't shoot the messenger. Now, here's the thing. What's the problem with our plan? The plan is they can now know nothing about each other. Why? Because there's no context in which to do that. There's nothing that can pass messages. You see, when I speak, my vocal cords, I push air over them and they vibrate. And that vibration goes through the air as a context and it hits your eardrum and it vibrates your eardrum. And that stimulates a nerve in your brain that decodes that. And now we can have a conversation. The light hits me and then it goes off of me and it goes to you and your eyes pick it up and your brain. See, all this is context. And it allows us to know one another, but it also allows us to know God. And the amazing thing is that God creates this entire world as an environment and context, as a way of communicating. Have you thought about the world this way? That everything that you encounter every single day is a message to you from God. Everything. You never encounter anything that's not a message. Because the Bible is full of this imagery. The mountains, the rivers, the trees, the sun, the rain. It talks about all of these things in context of God communicating with us. Family, Father, Son, all these things. It's context. You look at these things and it tells you something about your relationship with God. It tells you something about who God is and how He loves you. The problem is that most of the time we don't see it. And you say, well, Steve, what about all the annoying things? Yes, the annoying things too. You realize in the curse that God said there's going to be thorns and thistles that you're going to have to deal with. Why? Because God's going to have to deal with us. We're annoying things now. Right after the fall, we are annoying things. God's constantly striving with us. He's constantly struggling with us. And yet He still loves us. And we learn the nature of that as we strive and struggle with the annoying things of the world. Next time you hit a mosquito, think, oh, that's how I am. Everything in creation exists this way. God also communicates through His Word. Because we have a hard time getting the message through the world that He has created. God gives us His Word. And this shows us something really important. God has mind and rationality, division and distinction. In fact, all things in the world show marks of mind and organization and complexity versus chaos. Everything is revealing the greatness and the glory of God when you see the expanse of the universe. And when you see the complexity of a single cell, everything from the tiniest thing to the greatest expanse is showing you who God is, the glory of His existence. But maybe nothing, in fact, we don't need to say maybe, for sure, nothing communicates who God is more than the person of Jesus Christ. In His ministry in the world, in His proclamation of the kingdom, Jesus is the full radiance of God. It takes a person to communicate a personal God. And so Jesus communicates in everything that He does. When you see Jesus on this earth, you see the exact representation of the Father. For Jesus can do nothing except what He sees His Father doing. He is the full radiance of the Father. When you see Jesus caring for the sick, you know how the Father, the God of the universe, feels about you when you're sick. When you see Jesus caring for the among the sinners. You know how God feels about you. And you might ask yourself, well, then why does God allow me to go through these things? Because He's using every tool at His disposal to bring you back. And if God only rewarded you, then likely you would go off and do more things that separate you from life. When you move away from God and move away from life, death starts to happen, and God allows that death to come upon you slowly so that you're not enveloped in it totally. You start to experience the death of moving away from Him so that you can be drawn back to Him because of His love. You see, one of the things that's fascinating, we've been studying the story of Joseph. One of the things that's fascinating is that Joseph's father gives him a coat of many colors before he's even earned it. God allows Joseph to go through agonizing difficulties so that he can be somebody who's truly glorious and not just wear the clothes of somebody who's truly glorious. It's a mark of the love of God in us. Now this is difficult for us because the only thing that we can do to learn about Jesus is to read in His Word, or at least that's the way that it seems. But when other believers have the Spirit of God in them, then Christ dwells inside of them. And this is one of the most important things that I can tell you. I was thinking recently about how when I was taught to do evangelism, I was taught to give arguments to people. People will have objections. What about this? People will ask questions like, can God make a rock so big that He can't pick it up? How do you answer questions like that? Well, He taught us all kinds of things about that. And I was thinking about how that approach to evangelism is largely unsuccessful. Because that's not how people come to know God. Jesus didn't come to this earth and present a whole bunch of arguments to people. What Jesus did is He came and He loved them the way the Father does. And what that means is that Christ is now left this earth, but He has ambassadors on this earth. And if you are a Christian, then you are Christ's ambassador, as if God were making His appeal through you. Do you understand how amazing that is? Do you understand how glorious that is? The God of the universe is saying, I have given you the greatest task possible to redeem these people who I love so much. You're going to be the one who represents me to them. You're going to be the one who loves them the way that I love them, that shows them the depth of my love and brings them in. It's not about an argument. It isn't about, evangelism is not about an argument. It's about loving people so that they can understand the love of God because they experience it in you. Then a lot of the things that we do as Christians don't seem so odd. Do you know that if we fail to do this, the Bible says that in Luke 19, it says that even the rocks will cry out. The third thing that we want to understand is, what is the relationship of knowing and being known? Now this is interesting because when we talk about knowing God, a lot of times we have the wrong impression in our head. Because we think about knowing God as like knowing our math tables, or knowing the periodic table of elements. Right? You know that. Now, let me ask Chad, and Chad, I hope you give the right answer, because otherwise this is like Paul's face. We've not practiced this, so you're witnessing danger right now. Chad, if I memorize the periodic table of elements, do I know it?
Nope.
Excellent. Whew.
You know it, but you don't know chemistry. How's that?
Right. So I know something about it, but I don't really know it. You see, the Bible talks about knowing things in really strange terms, and this is another thing that freaks people out. Because the Bible talks about knowing someone as in having sexual relationships with them. to know biblically. And that seems weird, you know, but the Bible's just full of weirdness. But that actually is pretty important, because what it means is that knowing has to do with union. You know something when you're united to it. For instance, this week I spent more time changing the oil of the same motorcycle. Now, you could have asked me before I started changing the oil of my motorcycle last week. You could have asked me, you could have said, do you know how to change the oil of your motorcycle? And I would have said yes. How wrong would I have been? Completely and utterly wrong. You can ask me today, do I know how to change the oil of my motorcycle? And I will say, I do not. But I am getting there. After hours and hours and hours of trying to change the oil of it, this seems really simple to you. You're going to say to yourself, how could this possibly take this long? You don't know me very well. I am starting to know, because I'm starting to have experience with this. I'm starting to really understand it. I'm starting to really see the intricacies that don't appear to be there until you start working. You see, the idea here is an important one, that you don't really know something until it's become a part of you. That's when you really know it. You can say, do you know woodworking? Well, the thing is, I'm not saying have you watched videos, have you read books on woodworking. I'm saying, do you know what it's really like? Has it become part of you? You see, that's the important thing about knowing and being known. When the Bible speaks of this, in 1 Corinthians 13, for now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I have been fully known. It's not saying you're going to know every little fact about who God is. When we go to heaven at the wedding supper of the Lamb, we will be truly united to God. And that ends up being a great and glorious thing, because when we're truly united to God, that means we're truly united to life. We're truly united to existence. Right now, we have some ideas about life and some ideas about existence, but we don't really know existence. We're not really united to existence. But there will come a time, because Christ is faithful, when we really will be united to that. And what is that going to look like? Well, 1 John chapter 2, verse 5 says something really fascinating. It says, but whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Now, here's the interesting thing about that passage. It can mean one of two things. When it says, whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected, it could mean the love for God. Meaning when you obey God, your love for God is perfected. And that makes sense. But that sentence, the way that it's structured, can have another meaning, and that is this, that when you obey God, God's love for you is perfected. Now that's really interesting. What it turns out is that both are true. That in our obedience to God, our love for God is perfected. When we say to God, God, you are so good, you are so great, you are full of life, and you are full of love, there is nothing better that I can think of than to manifest who you are in this world. There's no greater love than you can show than to say, God, I will do everything that you desire. There's nothing better. That's what Jesus did when he was on this earth. He said to the Father, there's nothing better than being obedient to you. There's nothing greater than doing your will. And it said that he was obedient even to death on a cross. Even when it came to death on a cross, he could see nothing better than being obedient to the Father. That is our love for God, but it's also God's love for us. Because in calling us to obedience, what is God doing? He's calling us to manifest who He is. He's calling us to be united to Him. He's calling us to be united to life, to glory, to the greatest thing that exists, to being. There is nothing better that God can do. There is no greater gift that God can give you than to say, obey me. If you think about God and you think about going to God and asking for the very best thing you could ask for, there is nothing greater than to have God say, obey me in this. God can't give you a house, He can't give you a car, He can't give you a relationship, He can't give you anything better than to say, obey me in this. To have you manifest who He is, to manifest His will, to be united to Him, there's nothing greater. This is how you enter into life and existence and goodness. You do it through Jesus, full obedience, and then you become somebody who obeys as well. There is nothing worse that anyone can ever hear than the words found in Matthew chapter 7, 21 through 23. Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name? And then will I declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you workers of lawlessness. They were never united to Him. They were never united to being and existence. They were never united to love. They never had the heart that motivates. They never had the inward condition of being like the Father. It's not just about our actions, but it's about the heart that motivates them. And see, that's where everything is transformed, because if you get taken to heaven and you're being forced to act in a way that you hate, it will not be heaven for you. But if your transformation has happened from the inside out, that you love who God is, you see that there could be nothing better than the God who exists, and that there's no greater gift that He can give you than to call you to be like Him, and your heart is transformed and you truly desire that, then heaven will be heaven for you. Then you will know Him fully, even as you are fully known. Well, how do we apply this? Well, the first thing is believe that God is Father. Believe that He is Father. Believe that the giving, that the fullness of life that radiates into the giving of life is who He is. Belong to Christ His Son through obedience. Understand that there is nothing better that you can have than to be united to Christ and to live like He did. And then finally become life and light to the world. Knowing God and being fully known, there is nothing greater than that. There is nothing you can dedicate your life to that is bigger than that. And there is no greater blessing that you're going to have in this world or in the next than to have those things be true of you, that you know Him fully, even as you are fully known.
for joining our worship service today. Please follow on our Facebook page where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian Church, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week, everyone.